there are quite several questions already being listed, and I'm sure several of them addresses some of the recommendations and comments. But before that, I would like to start with the questions which I find to be interesting in our current global world now. Understanding the success of the Sustainable Development Goal of the UN in a global stage will definitely be is definitely dependent upon such credibility and integrity of global institutions. One thing that we could simply notice, especially of the past several months, circling around the issue of COVID-19, several criticisms towards international agencies. One in particular to point out is the World Health Organization itself, the most important international agency during this time of the pandemic. And these are criticisms not coming from either small agencies, but one in particular that I think almost everyone knows, which comes directly from the President of the United States, which also threatened with some global fundings withdrawals, and of course this besides then the President of the US, I think also quite recently, it also comes from the leader of Brazil, also provide some criticism of either neutrality and sidelines, and how does it also relates to the global competition between America and China and global politics. So within that setting, as you also mentioned, that one of the most important part in ensuring the success of such global development plan would definitely rely upon cooperation between agencies, between different government and nations, and different countries. Partnership itself is part of one of the main key goals of the Sustainable Development Goal. And so perhaps if you could provide some comments or feedbacks, understanding the complex situation of global politics and the crucial role of international agencies.
Thank you so much for this kind of challenging, immediate questions, Sam. Let me first take on the criticism of United Nations agencies and the World Health Organization, in particular during this unique time. I mean, I think that at a time when there are so many losers through a global kind of crisis, and when I say losers, I mean people that are under political pressure or that are also under other pressure, economic pressure, and so on. I think it is logical that the fulcrum agency that has kind of the responsibility to guide, if you want, the world, through this crisis. I don't think that can be happening without mistakes. I have to tell you that from my point of view, as a country representative for the United Nations system, of which the World Health Organization is an important part, I cannot see at this point in time much evidence of what was catastrophically done wrong. I did, of course, observe that maybe WHO was not as quick as during the SARS time. At that time, they were criticized because they were too quick. Or the avian flu, they were criticized that they were too quick to, recommend lockdowns. So I thought they actually did quite well, and I see this really as an external constraint. It is true that when we talk about the United Nations, we are talking about 3 different United Nations. We are talking about, number 1, the United Nations of the member states. These are the 193 member states that govern the mandate of the United Nations, and this the General Assembly, but of course we also know about Security Council, where there are only 15 members and 5 permanent members with a veto power. So this is the United Nations for the member states, and the UN, unfortunately, very often is accountable for everything, whether it's the problem of the member states, or whether it's the problem of the organizations. That's the second UN, the UN of the agencies, the UN of the organizations, led by the Secretary General. And the third, and also very important, I think, UN is the UN of the NGOs. You know, the UN that they play a hugely important role in terms of the consciousness of the world, and we love collaborating with the NGOs, but it is about multi-stakeholder partnership, and I think that there are definitely constraints. You know, we cannot. We are, as I said, governed by our member states, and there are different influences, I would say, that determine kind of you know, how mandates are given to the United Nations, including quality of leadership of bilateral leaders. So I think within all of these constraints, and there are a few things that you know, could be mentioned. One would be Security Council issue that is you know, for a long time basically dominated by 5 countries. There is the issue of human rights, where you know, leadership of presidents and country leaders is extremely important to kind of get a momentum, a positive momentum going. And there is you know, issues of resources that the United Nations is depending on. We don't have our core funding is a relatively small amount of the overall budget basically that is given, and because of this, it's also natural that you know, we are collaborating with our host countries, and I don't see there is any kind of a contradiction between you know, being independent and collaborating basically with your host country. This is our raison d'etre, and especially WHO has a very strong link always to the you know, host country. And I think what was used there is basically a few you know, video footages where the head of the WHO was friendly with the head of you know, a powerful country, but to kind of derive from that you know, independence is not there. I think I would say let's wait for an independent investigation, but I think for the complexity of the situation that we were in, we have done actually quite okay.
I will straight away address some of the questions which have already been shared by our participants, our attendees. I will start with the first question, without name and anonymous, remains anonymous. The question particularly addressing the concerns of the immigrants, which you have on immigration and undocumented migrants in particular, as you have also touched on during your earlier presentation. I'll just read through the question. We have seen the Malaysian government launching immigration raids and detaining hundreds of undocumented migrants and sending them to immigration detention centers. We have also heard of immigration action being taken against communities that have yet to register with the UNHCR as asylum seekers or have their refugee status determined. We have also seen an increase in the incidence of COVID-19 infections in immigration detention centers. As UN resident coordinator in Malaysia, do you think these immigration actions are helpful in stopping the spread of COVID-19? And how do you view these actions in the context of a set of SDG goals that are supposed to leave no one behind? So that is a question. I think that's an interesting one, definitely, even though the emphasis is on Malaysia. It is also quite of a global situation in which the protection towards migrant workers is one of the main challenge, when also on the regulations of life and how does it also relates to the spread of COVID-19? It would be good to have some of your feedback, Mr. Stefan.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Excellent question. So in our view, we have in our view, basically solutions both in public health terms as well as in economic terms should be inclusive for the benefit of the host country. Because so the public health ones, I think, are very obvious. We have seen that raids are having a psychological effect, that people are not coming out anymore. There are, I think, quite a few places where you can hide, and then may get even infected and infect others. So that is not in the interest of the country. So in our view, from a pure public health point of view, there should be incentives, in fact, that undocumented come out, voluntarily come forward for testing if they have symptoms, if it's needed. And we believe that the management of, let's say, the reduction of migrants is a different issue and should be managed separately. We acknowledge that there is, of course, undocumented migrants is a problem in many countries, and that many countries have different policies. But to mix it with a public health response is not helpful. We also believe that in an inclusive reaching out to migrants in the time of socioeconomic recovery will only be beneficial for the country, and therefore we basically would encourage member states to do so. This is in line with the compact on migrants, which is a few years old and which was also kind of endorsed by Malaysia, and it's also in line, of course, with the leaving no one behind principle of the SDGs, which does not make a difference between national and non-nationals. Of course, we understand that there can be differential kind of laws for national and non-nationals, but the dignity of everybody, including of non-nationals, must be always there to come up with people-centered approaches.
Okay, I'll move to the next question by Andrew Hu. Andrew is also one of our guest speaker when we had a discussion on freedom of religion. Okay, so I would straight away mention the question, read through the question by Andrew. Could the 5.5% unemployment rate be understated? So still on the question on unemployment. If there could be anywhere from 2 to 8 million foreign workers in Malaysia, both documented and undocumented, the collapse of the informal economy due to COVID-19 has probably led to a huge increase in the unemployment of undocumented migrants and other people of irregular and uncertain immigration status. So it shows, I would understand the question in the sense of whether the information related to the number of people unemployed now could be understated based on what is being received by the agencies. If you have some comments on that.
Well, I mean, I don't know whether this is particularly this figure basically would be understating it. I know that there are some statistics which do not include non-nationals. And again, I think in terms of social statistics, it would be important to include everybody because that is the precondition to come up with good policies. Otherwise, I would just like to reiterate that we encourage, the government to kind of be as inclusive as possible in these difficult times, for the sake also of a quick recovery, for which we believe migrants will play or would play a very essential role.
Mm-hmm. There's also another question quite related to the situation on the economy, which relates to the UN framework on it assessing the economy. So this question by Azrul, I'll read through the question. Main part of the SDGs is concerning the social aspect. So he gave the example of the first to the sixth goal, not only of certain country, but for the whole world. As we enter the darkest moment of the recession, should the UN change the economic policies of focusing on growth to focusing on harmony? Instead of socio, I just continue reading the question. Instead of socio-economy to socio first, then economy. Change of benchmarking country based on harmony instead of GDP. The government, JLCs, corporation, public figures would then drive the culture change. Could this help achieve the main objective of the SDGs and creating more fulfilling new normals? Utopian it may sound, but wouldn't that be our dreams? That was from Azrul. If you have some feedback on that.
Thank you, Azrul. I think you know, the UN would very much agree with the end means relationship, that economy is a means towards harmony or well-being or poverty reduction, but it is a set of people-centered objectives. And you can see that the United Nations, at least until since 1990, has advocated to move away from a development measure from GDP only towards measures such as the Human Development Index, which includes non-economic dimensions such as educational status or longevity, to measure the developmental achievements of different countries. So in our view, the Sustainable Development Goals are indeed, you know, a comprehensive framework which seeks to foster and promote, be it harmony. I think harmony is one element of well-being, but harmony is an important one. SDG 16 would directly focus on harmony and peace, but it is also about you know, minimum standards so that nobody basically needs to live in poverty. And as we all know, poverty itself is multidimensional. Azrul has rightly pointed out that it's not one goal that is social, but it's 6 goals that already points out the different dimensions of let's say, social status. I think the power of the SDGs are that social goals, environmental goals, and economic goals are in the same rank. But I also have to say that currently, because of the United Nations, of the member states that I mentioned before, you know, the end economic policies are still defined by the member countries, very often with request for advice by the United Nations. But it is a world of sovereign states, and the United Nations is very often the facilitator and the support set of agencies for visions that Azrul has pointed out. I think we have very well conceptualized how such a vision could look like, and he has very nicely articulated actually that is in line with the Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you.
I'll move to the next question, which focuses more on human livelihood in a way. This question comes from Pauline from Kenya. I would like Mr. Stefan to address the issues of feeding the citizen during the pandemic, because many people are suffering after the lockdowns and they cannot attend to their daily sources of livelihoods. That is what is driving governments to open before they have flattened the curve. I think this relates to very much on the most basic needs of the people globally, on getting their basic food and a place to shed. So perhaps some comments from you.
Okay, so thank you. I think of course, feeding the citizens becomes in some countries, one of the primary functions of the state. So the state would be the primary responsible to make sure that there is enough humanitarian assistance, delivered to those that need basic amenities, including food. As of humanitarian law, there is, however, if the state kind of fails to deliver that, then the United Nations does have a role. In many instances, we are playing a supportive role. There is at the moment a quite massive humanitarian endeavor going on, where the Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs of the United Nations is managing a fund that does exactly what our colleague from Kenya was pointing at, namely providing humanitarian assistance, including for food items. This fund is relatively well, I think, already resourced by member states, so it is absolutely seen as a priority. In terms of Malaysia, I would only make one comment. I mean, I know that in Malaysia, of course, the situation was never as grave as perhaps in some of the African countries, but I also understand from our relationship with NGOs that have been in touch with some of the vulnerable groups, that the savings are minute of some of these people, and in a matter of days or weeks, many people also needed food items, even here in Malaysia. And we also received some complaints by NGOs that they were not allowed to operate. And our kind of encouragement would be to see these NGOs that reach out to some of those that are most needy as part of the essential services.
I'll go to the next question by Santa Nair. Interesting, it relates to education, this one. Also one of the main key goals of the SDG, certainly. From Santa Nair, hi, I am Santa Nair from Perak, Malaysia. I would like to know, where do you place loss of learning in education occurred during the pandemic, and how can teachers move forward to reduce this gap of learning loss, especially for primary school children? I want to add one point related to that, because definitely it is centered on the concern of education, and one of the key goals of the SDG is not just talking about education in general, but mention specifically quality education. And I would say now, from what I could notice, is that mainstream approach of education now is going through online, in some ways also quite similar as our conversation now. How does this online approach of education fits in within the discussion about quality education as the UNSDGs has pointed out?
I'm not an educational expert, but of course my answer to this would be that obviously I think we are not there yet to replace a normal schooling with digital means. I would say it's similar to our discussion here. I would love to be at a round table, but we do the second best here. But we don't need to kind of learn for life anymore. We should actually, but not as much as, let's say, children. So I think it is really a tragedy that children all over the world missed already one semester, and in many countries another semester will be lost or will be replaced by online learning systems, which impossibly can replace as I said, a physical classroom where people learn from the engagement with each other, from the direct contact with teachers. I think it will take a while until maybe we'll never have it. We'll have a virtual reality that can replace the physical education, basically, or the schooling in a way so that there is no loss in learning. So he rightly points out that in terms of quality of learning, this is another impact that COVID has, a negative impact that COVID has on the achievement of the education goal in SDGs.
Another question coming from Andrew. So this one in particular definitely relates to the what should I say, the problematic conditions which is currently faced mainly in the US, but it is also shows some resonance in a lot of other countries, particularly on the issue about the death in police custody of George Floyd. I think that's been covered by a lot of media platforms globally. So the question by Andrew relates to Black Lives Matter also resonates in Malaysia. We have had disproportionate death in police custody from amongst the Tamil and Indian community and also minority communities. In the context of SDG 16, I think that one is on justice and the institutions. Do you have any concerns about this? Even during COVID-19, we have had at least one death in police custody. The government and the police have strongly resisted and IPCMC, I think that's the main agency being proposed to ensure the integrity of the police and the institution. What more can be done to persuade them otherwise?
I think Andrew raises a very important issue, and using the tragic case of George Floyd to also draw kind of a link to any country, I think, in the world. And I think police is a very kind of tricky kind of institution in the sense that they have special powers bestowed by them, by the country, for law enforcement. And therefore, the regulation of excess of force needs to be also well checked and balanced. And therefore, from a good governance point of view, but also from a human rights point of view, it is extremely important that institutions are there to independently review potential excess of force, which exists in many countries in the world, to do this. So in our view, the Independent Police Complaint and Misconduct Commission, I think it's called the IPCMC, is a very important improvement of good governance in the country. Now, it can be understood that police has is not enthusiastic about this, but from a larger, I think, societal set of objectives, it is important to basically have an independent mechanism that can deal with potential misconduct of police, because, as I said, police is armed. Police has the role of enforcing the law, if necessary, also basically, with force, and therefore there needs to be special checks and balances in place.
I'll address one question from Irina here. So Irina first congratulated on the session and also on the development of the UNSDGs, as you presented earlier. Irina mentioned wondering how the framework address the health risk reduction and disaster. As we are aware, Malaysia experienced more from physical environment but less from the pandemic infectious historically. I wonder how the connection between health risk management being addressed with disaster shift from disaster event to risk management. My sense the question relates to in terms of how do we look into risk management first, more of a preventive approach rather than looking into a way to manage disasters upon the health disaster happening. Perhaps you can we can respond something related to risk management instead of managing disaster. Yeah.
Well, I mean, the UNSDGs is a broad framework that consists of 4 outcomes that are broadly related to the 4 kind of pillars of the SDGs: inclusivity, prosperity, planet or environment, and peace or good governance. And we have placed the risk reduction of health risk in the issue of inclusivity, which is in our first objective of the framework. In fact, we have adjusted the UNSDGs on the basis of COVID-19. The draft was practically ready to go to the government when the pandemic kind of exploded in March, and we have postponed the submission to the government to include this. I think the issue of risk management, risk reduction is one that is extremely important, I think, in the current development paradigm, because it has to do with resilience of a country. And so we do have sufficient entry points to work with the government on that in the context of, as I said, our first objective, inclusivity.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll read through another question from Mr. Ramon Navaratnam. Indeed, the SDGs could fail, but not because of COVID, but because of the rich will resist the rise of the poor people and poor countries. In fact, the UNU, I'm not sure what UNU stands for.
United Nations University.
Perhaps the United Nations University, yeah, could argue that poverty has largely caused COVID-19 itself, and that that's the aim by the rich, which is to achieve depopulation of the poor. So, what do you think on the comment or question by Mr. Ramon?
Well, I do think in a democracy, there is supposed to be the representation of all parts of society, and it should not be possible that the rich aim for the depopulation of the poor. I also think that in the United Nations context, because of the principle of one state, one voice in development matters, this cannot happen. But I do agree that the rigor of poverty reduction globally, is challenged by several issues, including the lack of resources that are available to kind of really address poverty reduction on a bigger scale in some parts of the world. The United Nations is always grappling with the gap between a very kind of powerful vision that we want to achieve and the resources that we have. So our answer to this is that in the end, our partners are sometimes much better placed to kind of address these issues, including, of course, first of all, the government. And that's why the relationship between the United Nations and all the governments is very important. There are different tools in the United Nations that I think avoid that what Ramon mentioned happens. But the progress is certainly suboptimal, and it is true that there is a significant danger that the SDGs will fail because of lack of political commitment to some of the goals, including, very importantly, poverty reduction.
Okay, I'll take this as one last question by Musanna. There's quite a number of questions came in quite the last minute. I'll just take this
really?
Musanna, yeah. Quite an interesting question. I'll just read it through because it relates to, I would say, part of an eating culture as part of the world. As the virus is highly suspected originated from a wet market in Wuhan, China, which essentially sells and brings the wildlife closer to human and potentially opens up risk of zoonotic infection. What would possibly the action and response towards a sustainable consumption in line with the SDG, and how this reaction could be balanced with the livestock industry that could as well address the economic impact of the pandemic? Interesting in the sense, the question relates to the situation of our human consumptions of food, and I think in the SDG also covers one part on oceans wildlife as well. Looking into this as part of a global and a wider perspective on development.
I mean, this is a very interesting question, and indeed, I mean, it is possible or likely that the move from animal to human has been affected by the consumption of some wild animal, possibly a bat or possibly even a pangolin. And I think this has a lot to do, not so much I think in terms of the definition of SDG 12, sustainable consumption, but much more with SDG 14 and 15, biodiversity on land and in water. Our answer would be that wildlife, kind of the wildlife industry, livestock industry, of course, has many regulations to avoid that infections like this are possible. Therefore, the livestock industry with regard to wildlife has to be even more tightly regulated, and we believe that there should be all measures enacted to avoid any kind of wildlife trafficking. Unfortunately, we also know that the demand side for wildlife, both in terms of food consumption, but also in terms of perhaps medicinal products, is significant. But we hope that one of the positive outcomes of COVID-19 is in fact a much stronger regime, stemming wildlife trafficking. I can tell you that the UN is, for example, involved in helping the government with using innovative technology, including drone technology and including artificial intelligence, to detect poachers and others. This can be done, as said, with strict regimes as well as strict conservation areas, which I want to make the point again that I made during my presentation, I think is also in interest from an economic point of view. The rainforests are, until very recently, the economic value was kind of measured in terms of how you could log the forest. But in fact, if you think that by now 75% of cancer treatments are coming from products in the rainforest, it becomes a completely different value, and new products are all the time being discovered and detected, and sustainable harvesting of these products could really kind of bring a lot more than unsustainable infringement in pristine rainforest, in your beautiful pristine rainforest. Thank you.
I'll address next one question by Nicole. The SDG aims or wants a 7% annual GDP growth in poor countries to eliminate poverty. So according to Nicole here, too much to ask for. Going back to same old model to get such growth that shall harm the environment, extraction and endless production that has caused the very current pandemic. The destruction of natural habitat is one cause of such pathogens moving from animals to human, and also trade goal 7.10 calls for more ready liberalization. That's something not too clear on that part, but mainly on looking into Nicole's question about the aim of the SDG for a 7% annual growth, and how does it relate to the situation on sustainable development goals in general?
Get the 7 annual growth rate from? I'm not sure.
Okay, so
That, I mean,
all
but I
right,
can say
yeah, maybe you can just give a response on that.
in principle, basically, in principle, you know, we are talking about very much the recognition of planetary boundaries that we recognize in the SDGs. We acknowledge that you know, the use of natural resources and also pollution goes beyond what the planet can cope with at this point in time. And one of the principles of the SDGs is really to balance growth with environment. I mean, one of the ways of how we deal with that is that there is good growth and there is not so good growth. And we are working with many private sector partners globally that you know, have really aligned themselves in terms of environmental sustainability fully with the Sustainable Development Goals. So it is about it's about building in the principles of you know, of SDGs into the business processes of private sectors. Unfortunately, the progress of this is not going fast enough. Because of course, you know, without the private sector, the SDGs will not be achieved.
There's one important question as well here on the development of vaccines. I think one of the main part of we could see of the recent response on the pandemic is there's a lot of corporations in partnership initiative when it comes to a common solution in developing the vaccine and addressing the concerns of the COVID-19 effects. So this question by Mr. Azhar is that, are we anywhere near to find a cure for the pandemic, be it repurposed drugs, antibodies, or even vaccine? Is it likely that we may end up without any vaccine at all?
I don't know, it's likely. I have to say I don't know the answer to this, because I think if any of the 100+ laboratories that works on a vaccine were already very close, I think they would be very careful to kind of also disseminate this widely, because of course there's a huge competition going on. I know that there's still, I think, you know, there's an opinion that that a vaccine will be sooner or later found, but of course, you know, it is always possible that a vaccine may be found at a time when, for example, the current COVID-19 virus has already moved on, has kind of mutated, which is, as we know, the problem with the flu virus, that every year there needs to be a new flu vaccination. What I can say is that there is a large effort going on to pool resources, and $8 billion have been mobilized to ensure that if a vaccine is found, that it is made accessible in the fastest way to everybody, so that we have equitable access of vaccine. And this platform consists of a number of UN member states, including the European Union and other European states, but also from other parts of the world. But they are the major funders, including also UK and Germany and others. It includes the Gates Foundation, the Gavi, which is the Global Association for Vaccination, and includes WHO and the UN. So I think this is a very, you know, promising initiative to be able to avoid competition, you know, between different producers once this vaccination is basically found, but instead to produce it in such amounts as soon as possible, so that everybody can get access in the shortest possible time period. But whether they will scientifically find it, I think that is nobody at this point in time, or very few people, would probably be able to predict this with reasonable certainty.
Okay, very much, Mr. Stefan, for your response and your contributions to the questions and also your earlier presentations. Indeed, I would say perhaps as my brief comment, understanding that your presentations and the responses to the questions covers the main topics related to the SDG, which covers 17 main goals. I would say that this webinar, I would see it as a discussion which is very wide scope as the demand to respond to such an expectation of which has been developed by the FDG that comes from itself. So I would like to thank you, Mr. Stefan, very much for participating in our IRF webinar session. Perhaps before I end the session, you may want to share any last inputs or feedbacks, or perhaps some ideas or comments regarding to our topic of COVID-19 and the SDG.
Now, let me just say that that I thoroughly enjoyed this interaction with all of you. I thought that each and every question was excellent in terms of its formulation, and has really also kind of enabled me to look at different issues from a new perspective. So it just once again kind of reiterates that it's always a pleasure to interact with the vibrant NGO and academic community. And I don't know whether there is somebody from other sectors as well, but certainly from these communities, it's really a pleasure. It was a pleasure to meet you all, and please always feel free to contact us if additional information is needed or collaboration is possible. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
And have a nice weekend, all of you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stefan. I would like to call for, as usual, I would like to call for all participant attendees on Zoom or even on Facebook for a round of applause, and a virtual round of applause. So I appreciate the contribution by Mr. Stefan. Before I end up our session discussion today, as usual, the IRF webinar series will be continuing in the coming weeks. In particular, I will invite all attendees and participants, Mr. Stefan as well, to join in our next session on the 20th of June, as usual, on Saturday, but a bit later than our usual time. Instead of at 3 o'clock, it's going to be at 4 o'clock next week, on the 20th of June. And our guest for the session would be Professor Ahmad Fauzi from University Science Malaysia and Dr. Azhar Ibrahim from the National University of Singapore on another important topic on the post-COVID-19, the rise of xenophobia, and analysis and solution. So till then, I hope to see you all again in our latest sessions, and I hope you all have a good time and stay safe and be healthy. Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.